Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar. Thank you for joining us. I'm Catherine Cardelus, co-moderator with Farah Carrasco Rueda for this webinar today, and I'm co-chair of the Capacity Building Committee and professor of Biology and Environmental Studies at Colgate University in upstate New York. My co-moderator will introduce herself in a moment, but I wanted to tell you a little bit about our webinar series. This webinar is part of a three-part webinar series on professional skills in tropical biology and conservation. And these webinars are in response to your feedback and requests, so please keep those requests coming. We really appreciate them and we take them very seriously. As you can see, we have one more webinar in this series called Communicating Tropical Biology and Conservation to Broad Audiences. And in September and October, we have many more. So we look forward to you all joining us. Just so you know, all of these webinars will be available at the end of each month. So this one will be available online on YouTube on the 31st of August, and any of those that were done in August. And the slides will be made available to you, so you won't have to frantically write notes. You will be able to have the slides in the future. And with that, I'll introduce, or my co-moderator will introduce herself.
Good afternoon with everybody. Welcome again to the symposium, to the webinar. My name is Farah Carrasco. I'm the chair of the Committee in Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And I want to provide first some guides for the webinar attendees. So just to let you know that you will only be able to see the speaker and their slides. Your microphone and video are not activated, only ours, the speakers and the moderators. You can submit your questions by writing through the Q&A tab that you will see over here as an example. Is this tab. Questions that you make can be anonymous, so please choose that option. And the incoming chat message from us or from the panelists can be seen, but you won't be able to reply. So today we are having the great pleasure to introduce three fabulous speakers. And we are going to introduce them one at a time. And please remember to post your questions during the presentations, and we will gonna review the questions by the end. So first of all, I want to introduce you Lisa Davenport. She is a National Geographic explorer and researcher scientist at the University of Florida. Her research focuses on animal behavior and tropical ecology. She is also the co-chair of the ATBC Awards Committee and an ATBC counselor from 2014 to 2016. Thank you, Lisa.
Okay. Hey, hi everyone, and again, thank you to the organizers and to ATBC members and anyone interested who's coming today. I'm very excited to help do this. As Farah said, I am the co-chair of the ATBC Awards Committee, and we just finished up some pretty extreme judging on the ATBC seed grants because we had such an amazing number of proposals that come in. So before I do anything else, I did want to highlight that this is an ongoing part of ATBC, having seed grants and awards. So the recent ones that we have done that I'm assuming are mostly for students that you will be of interest for is usually something that we do at the ATBC meetings, particularly the Student and Early Career Awards. When you attend a meeting, you may enter yourself into these different competitions, either for a talk or a poster. So we have the Louis Bacardi Award for Advances. That's more for conservation. We also have Al Gentry presenting speeches and posters that can be just basic science. And there's also the New Phytologist Poster Prize in Plant Biology, which is awarded by the new phytologists themselves. Now, what I'm going to focus on today, and which was new in 2020, is our ATBC seed research grants, which anyone within certain criteria who are young like first year or second year students, master's or a PhD can apply for. The other thing that you can self-nominate for is the Sodi Conservation Research Award, which is more for early career professionals who have already got some work underway. So today I'm going to talk a lot about proposals more for early career and maybe your first ever proposal. And so some of this will come from the experiences that we just had doing the seed grants and what we thought was good or bad. A lot of it is just sort of common sense and boilerplate. So I'll be very interested in some of the questions, and just realize some of this is my opinions after helping a large team of 8 people go through the like 70 some grants we've received and judged this year. So as I said, the ATBC seed grants is a new program. We originally thought we would have just 5, but partly because we did not have them, we chose 10 out of a pool of over 70. And so here's some information about this year's granting process. It will be very similar, we think, next year, although hopefully slightly improved in terms of timing and hopefully not so fraught with all the COVID issues. The requirements for these particular grants, as I said earlier, it was the master's or early doctoral students. We do have some limitations on allowable expenses. I'll talk about that in a more general sense. So supplies, etc., okay, but permanent equipment is not okay. You must be an ATBC member. So this is particularly trying to focus some assistance for the young members who are already part of ATBC, but you can join as you're applying at the beginning of the application. And you need to get a letter of support in addition to that application. So here in a general sense, from an excellent website from my alma mater at UNC Chapel Hill, the Writing Center has put together this diagram of the grant writing process. So first of all, obviously you need to match your needs and interests to the right funders and make sure that you are eligible, such as being a member and being in the first or proper year. And what I would recommend is to prepare your budgets early on in the process, because the budget can tell you a lot about what you're going to have to talk about. And actually, the organizers at UNC Writing Center tend to agree that that is one of the first steps before you start writing anything, actually. And so you can tailor a proposal to a feasible work plan, a time schedule, what you're going to do when, and a budget. And that, just having that out in quite a lot of detail at the beginning can help you to get writing, I think. Also, as you get through the proposal process, you submit the proposal, you get reviewed, you might get the reward, you might not. If you do not, definitely reapply. And this is, I'm speaking to everyone who applied and did not get a seed grant. If you're still eligible, please reapply. And I'm sure some of the committee members will be the same. And there are resources to get specific mentoring assistance on your proposals. So try again. But if you get the grant, one of the things that I think is important for young students is to also think about what you need to do the reports as you go along. And in this, maybe this is obvious to everyone but us older folks, but to get like photos and things for the more social media outputs that you might describe. And you will want to address that when you are writing your proposal too, about how you're going to disseminate your work. And so you have to be prepared to take photos and videos if you think that's appropriate. So here are just some general tips to apply early and often. Apply to lots of different proposals. To get them all, you'd have double the funding. I mean, none of us get all of our proposals granted. Some of us think like 1 in 5 or 1 in 2. We're extremely happy in a year, but you know, the fields can vary, you know, your field of interest can vary considerably from another field in terms of the rate of success at a proposal. Same in NSF, different fields have very high funding rates and others do not. So don't forget to include a cover letter. That gives you a place to include things that, especially if it's one of these proposals that they have now where you just have a limited block with a character limit. If there's something you really wanted to say, but there was no place to put it, you know, you can sneak that into your cover letter. But answer all the questions you get. And if you're rejected, as I said before, try again if you still can. You're going to see this come up a lot in this presentation. Give them what they want and be explicit and specific. Now, this is a very appropriate recommendation to be realistic in designing the project. But I would also say, if you're enthusiastic, that tends to come through. And so, you know, don't moderate your ambitions to the point that you're no longer excited about your project. If you have a very ambitious idea and you really want to do it, well, maybe that's what you should be trying to do. Now, within the proposal itself, you really need to make explicit the connections between your research questions and objectives, your methods, why, you know, what are you doing and why, and then what results you expect, and as I said before, a dissemination plan of those results. And another time, because it's very important, follow the application guidelines exactly. If you are missing a checkbox, you are going to lose serious points in the judging process. Okay, so early on, you need to think and focus on this project. What are the very specific research questions that you want to answer, and what relevance do these questions have? Where are you working? Are you working in basic science and theory, or is it more applied science or conservation? Within the realm of ATBC, we are open to all of these different subfields. You know, we can support social science as well as basic science. But you need to think about, given where you're working, what are the methods and what's the most appropriate? Quantitative methods, qualitative methods, both. You may know certain methods, but are there alternatives that are more sophisticated or actually easier to finish? And of course, you need to think carefully about your question, and are you doing experimental research? And if not, would that help answer the question better? Is it observational, lab research, or interviews as appropriate, obviously? So one of the most important things in any communications, I would say, whether it's a proposal or any of the other forms of communication, is thinking about your audience. Who is your audience? So, and I think some students miss that. And so there's gonna be a couple places here where I talk about this. But the majority of grant programs will have reviewers who know something about the disciplines. Now, you should know somewhat who the judges are, and if you think it'll be broader, and you might be speaking to people who don't actually know or are likely to know the methods or the exact theories you're talking about. So think about how sophisticated your reviewers might be, and so how much you do or do not need to explain. I think in general, of course, with ATBC, we are mostly getting scientists who can be familiar, or we'll have a mix so that we can address different subdisciplines. On the other hand, recognize that most readers are lazy. We do not want to have to sit with a paragraph for an hour and figure out, what does this person really want to say here? So it is your job to give the readers what they want and make it clear and accessible to them. Another important point, and this came out of the UNC Writing Center information that I thought was quite a good point, that reframing your project to fit a specific grant requirement is a legitimate, necessary part of the process, unless it will fundamentally change your project's goals or outcome. So if you're applying to an organization, and this will happen, I think, a lot in sort of the science conservation field. If you're going to a funder who's looking more for a conservation project, if you're doing something highly theoretical and you think they want local people involved, you know, you have to think very carefully. Are you really going to be able to reframe your project? But think about the options. We had an example where we were interested in mercury and in animals in particular, but it of course also spreads into human populations. And so maybe that can broaden the scope of your project to also include a human dimension and open you up to other funders. And then you would have to write a rather different proposal if you were talking more about the human dimension side. So just keep that in mind when you're looking actually for the funders. The final decision though will come down to whether the reviewer is really convinced about what you've said, about whether it's well planned and feasible. And as I said before, be as explicit as possible. And here I think is also some very good advice to think about if you're not doing it at the last minute. Predict the questions that a reviewer may have and make sure, go back and check and see that you have answered them. Okay, so here's a little more. Think of your reviewers. So reviewers are going to want to know, what are we going to learn? Why is it worth knowing? And how will we know that the conclusions are valid? Many funders now require you put on some criteria for success, which I won't go into in detail, but this can be a hard thing to think about sometimes. Also remember that the reviewers are people. So one thing I got from one of my colleagues who we were working together on these seed grants, do not ever insult your reviewers. And I know you never would, but you have to assume they have knowledge, but you also don't want to waste their time. You don't want to put methods that are totally inscrutable or excessive verbiage. You don't want to write 3 sentences where 1 sentence would do. And we have to be honest here, there is a possible trap in that reviewers can have their own bias. This does exist. I think I've seen it in some of my own grant applications. It can lead to very lopsided reviews where one person loves it and another person hates it. And you won't know if your reviewers are going to be on the side of a theoretical argument that you seem to be on or not. So you definitely need to present sides fairly when you think you might fall into a trap like this. Don't necessarily express your own bias if you can avoid it. Just work through the hypothetical structure that that should guide this sort of issue, the sort of issue you're working on. But again, just to be totally clear and concise and complete, applications are what makes reviewer happy. Clear, concise, please. Concise in particular, but all of those really. Okay, so also with the seed grant proposals, I felt that several of my colleagues, we often were most impressed when the students were clearly understanding and presenting their theoretical underpinning very well. So even if you think your project isn't about theory, it is based in previous work. It is based in other people's thinking and gaps in the understanding. And the better you can present that, I think instantly off the bat, your application will shine through better. So explain the ideas that came before this work and how your work fits into this as best as you possibly can. So that may be my most important opinion that came out of the seed grant work, is that often students are not really reflecting back as much as they could on what came before them and sharing that with the reviewers. Now here is something that I find very interesting, which is writing style. The technical style that we all have to work in science can be very dry and boring. So I think it's so refreshing when you can read a proposal and actually get somebody's personality. So this is a good thing, I think. The way you write can and will tell reviewers a lot about you. They can figure out if you're a real scholar, how you are as a person. Are you enthusiastic? Are you thorough? So I'm saying embrace the chance to share where you are from, what is unique about you, what draws you to the subject, if there are places where you feel you can do that. You can highlight, the creative aspects, the logic in the theory. You can highlight your analytical skills. And obviously, we all have to allow the scientific discipline and its conventions to determine our overall style, but somehow get your voice out there and your personality. So you can sum all this up with my last two words are be memorable. Now I'm going to take just the last less than half of my time here to talk about the components of a proposal, and I'm just going to highlight a couple the most here, like the abstract, intro, project, narrative. So about the abstract, the most important thing to know is that you should probably write it last. Know it will be read first, but it may also be read last and multiple times with very little else read in the middle. So it is sort of a very critical part of the process. That's because readers are going, the reviewers are going to, once they've read all the different proposals, they will only be able to go back and refer to their abstract. So it helped to remind them what is what is in it and interesting at a glance. And I will say, particularly at the bottom there, the most important, and this is partly maybe style too, some of the language you use can be very important. And if it's positive, use statements like, we will do this, and the objective of the study is this, and movement forward about what you're going to do. And as I was saying before, in the introduction in particular, I think it's important not to be too long-winded, but you also can't leave anything out. You have to say up front what you're going to do without getting it lost in a big, long preamble. So somehow try to bring it up front. The introduction needs to cover some key elements like the objectives and significance. And you need to provide a believable background and rationale. So again, not to insult your reviewer, don't claim your work is truly original, because no work is truly 100% original. So don't go, I would say, don't go overboard stating how this is so novel. It may well be the first time a species has ever been studied in some way or another, but there's still a lot of work on the behaviors that in other species, so that you can compare to. So establish that you know these precedents. So show that you're doing this professionally, and yet, so there's a little contradictory, but don't be shy about explaining the need for this new research. Where are the gaps? How are you fitting in, etc. And I would also say, if space, why are you personally prepared to do it? What is your training? And you can brag a little bit if possible, and if there's space and a place, you can do that. As I said, be memorable. So a little bit about yourself, I think, is very helpful. The project narrative is, of course, sort of the guts and the meat of your proposal. So don't leave them guessing about anything. Again, preempt any questions you think a reviewer might have. Read it and reread it, and what did I do and what did I say I would do? You have to tell them the hypotheses and which methods will address which hypotheses, which procedures. And then you have to have some predicted ability to say what will be your outcomes and deliverables. Again, on evaluation, this is becoming an important demand of funders, is what are going to be your criteria for success, and then the outreach, the dissemination. How are you what social media or scientific journals might this be appropriate for? And I've again repeated myself. Clearly and explicitly, please clarity and explicitly state the connections between your objectives, your methodologies, your hypotheses, and its outcomes. How is everything leading together? I'm not going to speak a lot about the budget, and I'm running out of time, but I think it's very worthwhile, as I said at the beginning, to set up an exhaustive budget at the very beginning, even if you can only ask for a portion. This is a good exercise to focus your mind on what are the activities you're going to do that are critical. It'll help you write your project narrative, and it may guide your choices about which funders could choose or could fund different parts of it. Make sure that all of the budget items are allowed for that funder. And just the last few minutes, I highly recommend getting any volunteer readers and ask them to check a few things. Do you make those explicit connections between the objectives and methodologies? Do you have a compelling argument for why this is a gap, why you need to do this? And then the feasibility question. Does it seem feasible or is it overly ambitious? But are you still excited? Because it's a little ambition can be good. Have you stated that the means grantors can use to evaluate the success of your project after you've executed it? Can you tell them how many publications might come, or how many people you might reach in a community if you're interviewing them? How many workshops might you run to share results? Finally, as I'm winding down here, I wanted to share our specific judging criteria, which was not that complicated, but you'll see where some of my comments came from. So one of the criteria was the relevant literature cited. So as I said, I think a lot of us were very impressed if the student showed an understanding of their place in previous work, and not just like work of the last year. Go back 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, and really understand the precedents. Of course, is your methodology appropriate? And so you have to explain what you're doing well, and you have to explain why you're doing it well. Is the budget request justified? And that has to do with the equipment you need, and is it extravagant? And also travel and living expenses, are they appropriate? Obviously, you can't do anything much to control the letters of support other than choosing the right people who you think will provide you with strong letters of support. But that is another area where the reviewers get a lot of insight into the student's personality, and some things may really shine out from this. So this is just my last slide. Here are some resources. The UNC Writing Center that has some good tips, but there's several other places, and one of the articles talks about what reviewers are looking for, the Krasowski and Salomon. That's all I have today.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And just a reminder for the participants to post your questions in the Q&A tab. And now I want to welcome Ima Oliveras. She's a lecturer in ecosystem science at the University of Oxford in the UK. Her research focuses on disturbance ecology in tropical ecosystems, ecophysiology, and remote sensing. She's an associate editor of Journal of Ecology, and also she's an ATBC counselor from 2019 to 2021. Welcome, Ima. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Farah. Thank you for inviting me for this. Let me start sharing. Okay. I hope you can all see my screen at the moment. I'm going to be talking today about the first scientific paper, and what inspired me to give this presentation is because I wished someone had given me some insight when at the very early on writing you have done your research, you are a certain number of months or years into your research, and now it's say, well, it's time to prepare the publication, and where do you start? So I hope that this is not an exhaustive list, but it's some tips I've been learning along the way, and I hope they can be useful. And the slides will be made available afterwards through the webpage of the webinar page. So something to take into account is the type of information that you want to pursue in a scientific article. And I think it's important that you want to be aware that you want to inform, but also to persuade the reader. So you want to tell the reader about your work, about your findings, but you also want to persuade them that the conclusions that you draw from the work you did. So on something that it's, I'm going to be very repetitive throughout the talk on that, but it starts early on. So daily writing and write and repeat and review. It's, I think that's, it's the most helpful way of producing a good paper. It's practicing daily, especially if you want to start with summaries, outlines, mind maps, drawings on how to address questions. All this work that you do on an everyday basis is ultimately reflected on your scientific article. And as I say, yeah, it requires learning how to write. Academic writing is a style of writing, and it's only learned by practicing and practice. So I'm going to be talking about the typical structure of a scientific paper that consists in a title with some keywords, an abstract, introduction, methods, result, discussion, and conclusions, and then some acknowledgements, references, and supplementary information. Other journals maybe have different structures, but I'm going to be giving this one an overview because it's the most common in ecology and conservation science. So a little bit, I'm going to start about the titles. So the titles, it's better if they are short, concise, and directional. And that's better than the long generic ones. Try to minimize the numbers of words. For example, Biotropica recommends no more than 12 words. So does Journal of Ecology, and some other journals even less. And try avoiding these very descriptive words like study of, observations, or exploring. And also where species names are given, it should be clear for the general reader what type of organism I'm being referred. So either by using the family appellation or the common name. So for example, invasion of African savanna woodlands by the jellyfish tree, Medusagine oppositifolia, or invasion of savanna woodlands by Medusagine oppositifolia of this family, Medusaginaceae. Also, if the title includes a geographical locality, it should make sure that it's clear to the general reader. So you say effect of habitat fragmentation on pollination networks on Flores, Indonesia, not just on Flores and full stop, but because not everyone knows where everything is around the world. Usually it's a good practice if it summarizes a good some sort of result. So increase something like such as increased mortality on the tropical savanna tree Quilmeyera rubiflora with a warmer climate. It's good if it's also states a question or a problem, but avoid any type of speculation. So you can state a question or a problem. So, but don't go like climate change jeopardizes the future of the tropical savanna if you only studied the population of a single species. So say, is the neotropical savanna tree Quilmeyera rubiflora resilient to a warmer climate? And that's stating a question. Avoid abbreviations in the title. And as a keyword, usually you need to focus on the content of the study to attract the reader's interest. It's like a little bit think on the hashtags that you are going to put on your Twitter for the keywords. Make them searchable. So choose words that are popular and generic. And think on how would you Google your study in a search engine in Google or whatever search engine you use, and also usually these keywords are used for indexing purposes as well. So people is how they are going to find your paper. Avoid repeating words from the title because the title also is indexed and usually appears on search engines. And try avoiding too method-specific words. So try to make it like a selling point. And better a few good keywords than too many bad ones. With the abstract, many of what Lisa said already with the grant proposals applies the same. So I think I would also, and I agree with her, write it the last thing, and also agree with her that this is the most important part of the study. Most people are only going to read the abstract because you're going to search, you're going to do the search, they are going to find you with the keyword or the title, and they are going to read the abstract and going to decide whether it is of their interest or not. So it's very important to spend time on the abstract, but it's also good to write it as the same as the last thing. And the key is readability. So it has to be self-sufficient and independent of the manuscript. It has to be a little self-contained piece of text. And as a general template, it's good to think on a short background. Why are the problem and the results important and why should be studied? A statement of the problem, what problem specifically you are trying to solve or to address. The methods and the results. What are the key findings? Don't try to explain all the results. Choose the key findings of the situation and what are the implications of these findings. And something that is very important, avoid being very speculative. There's a lot of papers that get criticized or rejected by being too speculative at the beginning, especially in the abstract. So don't say that you are going to try to solve climate change or something like that. Be moderate with your expectations. In the introduction session is where you address the background of the problem, and usually you could address a paragraph or so on what is the problem, why do we even care about the problem that you are studying, what is the state of art, and here again what Lisa said is very useful. So don't limit yourself on putting the state of the art of the last 5 to 10 years. Try to go deeper, try to show the reader that you really understand where is this theory and the state of the problem coming from throughout the scientific history. What are the knowledge gaps that we are having towards that problem? And what are the practical implications on the topic that you analyze in the paper? And how you're going to be addressing this. And you're going to be addressing this with the questions, hypotheses, and or predictions. So I think that this is a good scheme to see how you are going to set up the domain. As I said, what is the problem, the importance of the subject on the general statements, and an overview on the research on the subject. Don't limit to be mostly contemporary, but also cite references that are not that contemporary, that set the baseline of that research. And set up dispute your correct concept, or here you can, if you're defending a certain position, you can justify why you are defending that position, or the research gaps and the knowledge gaps that are in that reference, and develop a research question, hypothesis, and problem. And then implement the point of view. So plan the purpose of the study, the qualities of the study, and you can also, if you wish, that's not always presented in ecology, but it's an option that I've seen it in several places, that you define what are the significant outcomes, why is this important, in other words. With just a few words about the questions I have and hypotheses. Keep them clear and concise. So make an outline, and that's very important, and think of each question or hypothesis. Also think how you are going to address that question of hypothesis. I'm assuming that at this stage you have already collected the data, but then what statistical analysis are you going to apply to answer or test that hypothesis, and how are you going to present those results that are going to describe that question or hypothesis, and keep it consistent throughout the manuscript. That helps the reader a lot. lead the reader to understand the hypothesis and means of testing. It's also very important that you provide the context, either before in the introduction when you present the state of art, or after the hypothesis. According to this, we also hypothesize that this is going to happen. So it's a tentative explanation. And remember that usually research is to prove the hypothesis false. Regarding the methods, I think the methods have to be contained, but with sufficient detail. It has to have I cannot pronounce that word, repeatability. So report what you did so the reader could repeat the findings. And that doesn't mean that it's a laundry list. Don't put a list of I did that. So you have to report it with sufficient detail, but doesn't need to be a laundry list. Usually they are written in the past tense, and I'm going to go back a little bit later on writing style in the last slides. And in the structure, usually it follows where your study site is, the experimental design, the subject, you present your subjects, your variables, the data collection, how the procedures, materials that you used, lab or analytical analysis, and then the statistical analysis. Describe, and it's a good use to describe them and how you address the study objective questions or hypotheses by this statistical analysis. So don't just describe all the analysis that you did in a general way without leaving the reader to guess what did you use to answer what. So in this table, it's a summary of what I just said. It's an outline of the study design. Then you describe the subjects and the methods of sampling, the number of subjects, justify the sample size, inclusion, exclusion, or withdrawal criteria. If you have to withdraw, I don't know, a number of specimens because you couldn't get to the species level, or why you decided to keep to the morphospecies, etc. What are the independent, dependent, and so forth variables? In a general way, what type of materials, equipment of instruments you used, and a description in chronological order of what was done by more or less, and by whom, and then the methods on the statistical methods. And remember also to see which statistical significance you're using and the software. So moving to the results now, frame them within your questions or hypotheses and order them from most to least important. Usually this is very useful, especially when you're starting to write your first papers. It helps you to keep the structure a little bit like Lisa said when you're writing a grant, that everything ties together. I think that this is a very good practice to keep in a scientific manuscript, because sometimes you can, if you're going to just present results and you're not going to know what are you trying to address, the reader gets lost. So it's good that you make maybe subheadings in the results section on saying that are addressing the different research questions that you have. And describe the results with sufficient detail that to establish their validity, and present them supported by analysis, also by tables and figures that I'm going to go in short. Usually are also written in past tense. And refer to the tables, to the figures, and the supplementary material. So any table, figure, or supplementary material, supplementary table or figure has to be mentioned at some point in the main text. And avoid interpreting the results, repeating results. So don't include the same data in a table and in a figure. Describing two obvious results as well. So it's good to explain with a lot of detail, but no need to do something that it's really obvious. And presenting results that don't address somehow the question or hypothesis. With the tables and figures, usually every journal have their own rules on how many tables and figures a study should have. So it's good when you start having an idea on where you're going to submit it to check that. But when you're working on the manuscript, try to produce figures and tables. And as I said, perhaps try to address which ones are going to address each question or have hypotheses. Usually in a manuscript, 2 to 3 tables and 4 to 5 figures is a good practice. You should be able to present your scientific results with this number of tables and figures, and everything else would go to supporting information. And very, very important is to make them self-explanatory and visually attractive. Use captions to support the table. So a table also and a figure should be independent from the text, so that readers should be able to understand that table or figure without having to go back to the text to understand it. And I think that sometimes many people, when they are reading articles, the first thing that they go is to the figures. So it's also very important to make them very self-explanatory and also well presented visually. And as I said, keep the figures and tables that directly address the questions and hypotheses in the main text. With the discussion, so the discussion usually is the section that guides the readers to understand the study and the significance to the field. And it is where you should critically analyze, compare, and discourse your results based on the stated problem and the other research, questions and hypotheses, the methods, and also with the state of art. So it's also important to visit the literature review that you did in the introduction and expand it from there. And it needs to be carefully structured because it's frequently the weakest component of the manuscript. So spend time on it. And as a common mistake is to sometimes to use too much rhetoric. Another very common mistake is to overstate the findings, or on the opposite end, to undersell your work. So try to not overstate or do much speculations of how amazing your work was, but also don't oversell your work. And yeah, don't generate assertions that go beyond what is supported by the data and the results that have been presented in your study. So that's a very broad example of a discussion template, but it's not exhaustive, and there's many others. That's only one that I found that more or less works in my practice, but there's others as well. So state the study's major finding and restate your question, hypotheses, and predictions. You don't have to fully repeat yourself, but just a summary of 2-3 lines on what is the major findings and restating your main aims of the study. Explain the meaning and importance of the finding, relate them to similar studies, also consider alternative explanations for the findings, and state the relevance of the finding, of what you found in your research. Also very important to acknowledge the limitations of your study, and no need to make it negative. It's good to keep a positive tone in the discussion without, as I said, being too overselling. But it's always good to say, well, this study has presented these limitations or these caveats, and it's good that you acknowledge what are those, and that opens suggestions for further research. Some papers want to, not everyone presents conclusions, but I think it's kind of good practice either to have a short subsection of discussions, of conclusions, sorry, or a last paragraph of a few conclusions. And as a reminder, something I come across is that they are repeating the abstract. They are not another abstract. It's a text that summarizes what are the main take-home messages of the study and the implications of that study. And as I said, some journals don't include it, as a section, but it's good to devote the last paragraph of concluding remarks. So for reference and citations, usually checks the journal style for references and how you're going to have to present the literature in the reference sections. Good practice is when citing literature throughout the text, try to keep it concise. So say, apples can be red, green, or yellow, Oliveris et al. 2020, and avoid saying a study by Oliveris et al. In the UK found that apples can be red, green, or yellow. That's lengthy and that in the other ways, and it's not a concise way of writing. So that's and that's a very common way of writing, especially early in the career. Also choose citations wisely, not usually the latest articles, but many theories and evidence were found before the 2000s too. So, and try to limit citations usually to 3 or 4 citations for a statement, maybe 5. So no need to go for more than that. Supplementary information, that's something that I'm finding myself, many of my students asking me about, and to be honest, is something that started appearing in maybe 10 to 15 years ago more. It wasn't common practice before. It's usually it's tables and figures that are not core to the message, but that they support and contribute to answering your questions and hypotheses. Also sometimes and increasingly used to expand the methods section. So it's inclusion of protocols or where you can find the data or supporting tables for the statistical analysis and so forth. Usually there's no length limit. So you can put as many things as you wish there, but also choose wisely what you put in there. And about authorship, I wanted to mention very quick authorship. Find and download the authorship guidelines of your target journal and discuss authorship order, usually with the team and your supervisor early on. As a rule of thumb, usually the first author is the person that conducted the study, collected data, analyzed, wrote the paper, and last author should be the PI or supervisor. But rules can change by topic or by region. So for instance, I came across in Brazil, they have different rules than in Europe, for instance, and not all authors wants to be not all supervisors wish to be the last author in Brazil. So also the author contribution statements, they are very good practice and increasingly common, so use them. And I'm going to use the last couple of minutes to do some basic rules that were very useful for me at the beginning. So use the first person and active voice. And this is, I think it's general for every early career, but especially also for non-natives. Write concisely. So review each sentence and try to reduce the number of words. So reread the sentence and think how many words I'm going to delete in this sentence every time. Stick to your message and avoid too much repetition. Try to use the past tense in the abstract, in the methods, results, and then in the introduction and the discussion when referring to your own work. And this is not exhaustive, that is changing, but it's usually good practice, especially early in your career. And these are 7 tips for concise writing. I think that because I'm also moving is try to take writing seriously every day and review. Stick to your message and think on what's your paper goal. Can you summarize the key points in a few sentences? Add summary sentences at the top of your working document in sections and subsections. Get to the point and don't repeat yourself too often. Add keywords in this section, as I was saying. Avoid unnecessarily let-ins, remove unnecessary words, and simplify your language. And I'm going to skip this one because that's a review of on how you are reviewing the paragraph and using sentences as short as possible. So try to usually write a sentence, write the next sentence and reread them and try to cut them and also see that they flow in a logical manner, so they don't jump onto ideas, because if they jump into ideas, you may want to rewrite it into paragraph, or if it feels too short, you combine that sentence in just one sentence and so forth. And you're gonna have this. This is some paper that I found with some tips on unnecessary let-ins, like citation references. So for instance, in a recent study, Smith and I showed if you say giraffes are larger than squirrels, you save 6 words. Also display the eaten references. So in figure 1, we show that just mention figure word, you say 4 words, and or inefficient let-ins. If you find yourself swimming in the ocean, be wary of sharks. Be wary of sharks when swimming in the ocean. And this is also some tips to simplify language. They are going to be available through the webinar webpage, and also you'll see it in the YouTube version here. And that's it. I'm going to stop here. Those are further resources. This book is really good. It's what I used at the beginning. And good luck, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Ima. That would have been very useful when I was starting out as well. So I really appreciate your tips even now. I'm really pleased to introduce our next speaker, who will be Jennifer Powers. Jennifer is a professor of ecology, evolution, and behavior, and plant microbial biology at the University of Minnesota. She studies biogeochemistry and ecosystem ecology of tropical forests, particularly seasonally dry forests. And importantly, for this webinar, she's the editor-in-chief of Biotropica. So pay attention. I think we'll all be sitting on the edge of our seats. Thank you. And here is Jennifer Powers.
Thanks so much. I'm just gonna get started here. Let's see. So is that working? Yes. Okay, great. Awesome. So let's see here. So first I want to thank you all for the introduction, Kat, and thank you for the invitation to talk to you guys all today. So I think it's great to follow Lisa and to follow Ima and all of the material that they shared, because thinking about publishing your paper really fits in this context of writing proposals and writing manuscripts. So let's say you took all of Lisa's advice and you got your first grant and it was a success, and you wrote your first manuscript based on all the feedback you got from Ima. Congratulations. Now the hard work starts. So you might think that you're at the end of the process, but really in some ways what you're starting is a new phase of the process of science, which is taking what you've learned in your study and then sharing it with the world through publication. So this is a roadmap of, just a brief roadmap of what I'm going to talk about today. First, what I'm going to do is take a real sort of broad overview of the nuts and the bolts of the publication process. It's often mysterious. You send your manuscript off into the ether, and then, you know, some months later you get a response. What we're going to do is really talk about what happens once you press that submit button. And then we'll sort of step back from that broad overview and talk about some of the issues involved with submitting your manuscripts, things you need to think about beforehand, and then also things that you'll need to deal with once you get a response back from a journal. And after your paper comes out, you might think that your work is over, but there's still things you can do to help spread the word about the work you've done. And last, what I'll do is summarize with some resources. And again, these resources will be available to you. Okay, so here's an overview of the publication process. And this really is a description of what happens once you press that submit button and actually send your manuscript to a journal. So this is a slide that I took from Wiley, and it starts here. I hope you can see my little cursor. It starts with you as an author submitting your manuscript to a journal. The first thing that happens is a checking process where someone will check to make sure that all of your manuscript files are complete. And then if that is the case, your manuscript gets sent to someone like me, to an editor. And the editor then makes a quick sort of triage of the journal, a really quick scan. And it's some manuscripts are rejected at that stage, at the submission stage. I review, I see 400 plus manuscripts a year. And so I need to make really quick decisions. And sometimes it's pretty easy. I reject a paper without prejudice. And that could be, you know, because it's just not appropriate for our journal for Biotropica. So don't send us your papers on soybean genetics. It's just not what we publish. Those are easy papers to send back to the authors and say, hey, you know, this isn't really the kind of science we do. Other papers are rejected because even though they're potentially, say, Biotropica papers, the science just isn't there. The science isn't there yet. And so at that point, I'll send some feedback and say, hey, you know, this seems like a really interesting idea, but I think you need another season of data to really nail this idea. But let's say happily, your manuscript falls into this category of those that are potentially publishable by a journal. At that point, your manuscript might be sent to a more specialized editor, a subject editor. At Biotropica, we have 50 plus experts who are subject editors, and or handling editors is another word for them. What the handling or the subject editor will do is a scan of your paper, and they'll choose reviewers. You can suggest some reviewers, and then typically the editor or subject editor will also find additional reviewers who are experts in the field. The next step is the reviewers read your paper and they send a review back. That review goes back to the editor who typically solicits more than one review, anywhere from 2 to sometimes 4 or more reviews. And the editor takes that feedback and synthesizes it and makes a decision. That decision could be, at that stage, your manuscript could be rejected for a number of reasons. Your manuscript could be accepted, in which case it goes off to production and publication, or the editor might send you, the manuscript back to you with revisions. In which case then you need to read all of the feedback that you've gotten very carefully, revise your manuscript, come up with a response to reviewer letter, which we'll talk about, and then the manuscript is resubmitted, and this whole process goes again. We turn another wheel of this process. And it's important to know that this process of publication and peer review is really an iterative process. You know, sometimes we go through, I guess I'm speaking from my own experience, sometimes it takes me 4 rounds of this process to get my own papers published. So this is an iterative process, and hopefully at each stage of the process, the manuscript is improving. So what do reviewers do when they are asked to review a paper? Well, first the reviewer has to make a decision. Do I want to review this manuscript or not? Is this within my field? Do I have any potential conflicts with these authors that might prevent an unbiased review? So let's say the reviewer accepts the manuscript to review. What they do is a very careful read of the manuscript, once or twice even, or more, and they're assessing the manuscript on a number of different criteria. These include things like the novelty of the work or what kind of contribution it makes. So how does this advance the field? They are looking for execution. From the methods that you have described, you know, can reviewers find any flaws in the design of the study, in the data analysis and statistical methods, in the interpretation of the data? Does your the text that you've written in results actually match what reviewers are looking at when they look at your figures? They're also looking for clarity of the text. Is the text clear? Are the figures clear? Do the tables make sense? And last, they're making an evaluation of the quality of the scholarship. You know, have you identified interesting and meaningful knowledge gap? Have you placed the work that you're doing in the broader context of work that has gone, of previous work that has gone on this topic? Have you cited the appropriate literature and cited that literature in a correct way? So the reviewer is doing a very careful assessment of your manuscript for these different criteria. And then what they do is prepare a review. Reviews, once you've read, I guess in my case, like 2,000 of them, you realize that reviews have a common structure. Typically what a reviewer does is use the first paragraph or a few sentences of a review to summarize what the authors did and maybe say something about what you found. This might not be news to you, right? This may not be helpful information for you, but what this does is let the editor know that the reviewer has read the manuscript, that the reviewer understands the manuscript, and the reviewers typically then, after describing what the authors have done, what the authors find, they do an evaluation of the major strengths and weaknesses of the manuscript. And that's typically in the first paragraph or two of a review. Next, what you'll often find, not all reviews are the same, but what you'll often find is a list of minor comments. And these are typically line by line comments where the reviewer says, oh, page 5, line 2, there's a typo. Oh, page 8, line 27, you spelled this chemical wrong or whatever. So these are minor comments, little things that need to be fixed. And sometimes reviewers will include a marked draft. So they'll actually receive a PDF of your file and they will go through and make comments on that PDF. And sometimes they return that to you as well. So these reviews go back to the editor. And then the editor takes the different views, takes the different reviews and reads them very carefully. And many cases an editor will review the paper themselves as sort of an additional voice, and then the editor makes a decision. And that decision could be to accept the manuscript without any changes. Obviously, this is the best possible decision for you, but I would caution us all that that's pretty rare. And accept with minor revisions means that the journal is very much interested in publishing this, and they think there's just a little bit more work that you need to do to make this manuscript acceptable. Except after major revisions, some consider this a conditional acceptance, although manuscripts can get rejected after major revisions. But what this means is that the science, the language, it's just not there yet. And typically, there will be a list of suggestions on what an author will need to do to revise the manuscript. Revise and resubmit is another decision you might get, and that's a conditional rejection. And what this really means is the journal is interested in the idea, in the basic study that you've done, but a lot of work, is going to be required to turn this into a manuscript that could be acceptable by that journal. The last decision is that the paper could be rejected outright. And at that point, you need to go back to the drawing board and either send the paper to, revise the paper based on the feedback you get, send it to another journal, or really think is this work ready for publication, or is it not quite there? Okay, so that's a big picture overview of the publication process. That's really what happens once you send your, once you hit submit on the manuscript submission software. Now what we're going to do is sort of back up and ask the questions. What are the things you do before you hit that button submit? And then what are the things that you go through as an author once you get that decision back from an editor? Okay, so you are ready to go. You're ready to submit your manuscript. What are the things you have to do to get yourself to that point? So one of the things you have to do, and this is something that really is is a process that happens much earlier than before you hit submit, is to decide which journal you're going to target. And then you have to write a cover letter, and that is read by the editor. And then you sort of later down the line, the next thing we're going to talk about is a response to reviewers letter. So again, where to submit is a decision that happens obviously before you submit. Writing a cover letter is something that happens before you submit. And then we'll talk about response to reviewers letter, which is something you craft after you have a decision. So there's a lot of debate about what to consider when you're thinking about which journal you should submit to. Many people use impact factor of the journals as one of the criteria that influence their decision of where you want to send your journal. I think send your manuscript. I think that impact factor is sort of one of a suite of factors you should consider when you're making this decision, but it shouldn't be the only criterion. There are many different kinds of journals out there. Society journals like Biotropica are edited by scientists. Other journals are edited by professional editors, or some journals, not all journals, but some journals are edited by professional editors and not necessarily scientists. So those are things that you might consider when you're deciding where to submit your manuscript. But what I tell my students and what I think when I'm deciding where to send a manuscript is, who do you want to read your paper? You know, where the paper is published that you read as a scientist, where are the people who is reading those journals that you want your work to be read in? Who are your peers? Who are your colleagues? I think those are also important considerations when you're thinking about where to submit a manuscript. And last, I would just sort of try to caution us all against trying to sneak a manuscript in somewhere. You don't want to be part of a room full of people who say, you know, what's the highest impact factor journal that we can get this work into? I think that that's not the most helpful. That's not the most helpful approach to decide what might be an appropriate journal. And this is sort of increasingly something to watch out for. This certainly wasn't the case when I was in grad school, but now with the internet being such a part of our lives, there have been changes in the publishing landscape, and there are predatory journals. There are journals that you might not have heard of that might charge you huge fees, that promise you very quick acceptance, that don't have strong peer review processes. You might get an invitation via a mass email. If I get an invitation to submit a paper to a journal that says, "Dear Mr. Powers, we're really interested in your work, please submit to our journal," that's sort of a red flag. There's a list maintained by a nonprofit group, predatoryjournals.com, and what they do is try to flag journals. And there's a lot of reasons why you kind of don't want to get, this is my own personal opinion, I guess I would say, but why you sort of want to watch out for predatory journals. And last, and this is something that's increasingly common in many subdisciplines in biology, is the idea of a preprint server. In biology, bioRxiv is probably the most well-known preprint server. Preprint servers basically are repositories of manuscripts that have not gone through, that are not published and have not gone through a peer review process. And there are some pros and some cons to posting your work to a preprint server before you would send it off to a peer-reviewed journal. And I am agnostic as to whether or not a preprint server is right for you. They allow you to quickly post your manuscript and get a citable DOI before you submit to a journal. So it allows you to cite your work. And in some fields, if you're worried about getting scooped, what people do is post manuscripts to these preprint servers. This again is more common in some fields than others. Some people like it because they think it gives them an opportunity to get feedback on a manuscript before they're actually submitted to peer review. So when you're submitting your manuscript, one thing that goes along with the files, the texts, the figures, etc., is a cover letter. And here you're speaking to the editor. Many journals on their instructions to authors website, they explicitly state what they want you to include in the cover letter. And this is a very brief, letter, a paragraph or two, but what you want to do is really speak to that editor and try to hook them. Why is your study novel or important? Why is it a good fit for this journal? And you also may want to state that all authors have agreed to the manuscript and they have read it. This is just an example of a cover letter. This one is actually probably a little bit too long, I would say, but this one is one that I wrote. And this just states, dear editor, I'm writing on behalf of my co-authors to submit a manuscript entitled Catastrophic Tropical Drought Kills Hydraulically Vulnerable Tree Species for consideration in your journal. And then what I try to do is put it in context and differentiate why I think this work merits publication for that audience in that journal. Red flags for an editor. So I read, like I said, I read 400 plus cover letters a year. I read every single cover letter. These are red flags, certainly for a journal like Biotropica. If the title of your manuscript or anywhere in your cover letter, you use the words preliminary or pilot study, that suggests to an editor that your work is either a very modest data set or probably likely to change in the future. So those are terms I would stay away from. If you can state your work in terms of hypotheses or predictions, that is much stronger than saying your goals were to explore something or to describe something or to document something. And this goes right back to what Lisa and Ima have told us with writing grants and then writing those manuscripts. And then last, introductions that fail to place work into a broader context are pretty much non-starters. If you can't show how the work you did relates to previous work and this broader context, that's a non-starter. This is a great blog post. Again, you can look at this at your own time. The 5 pivotal paragraphs in a paper. If an editor is going to read anything, there are 5 paragraphs they'll read: the abstract, the first paragraph of the introduction, the last paragraph of the introduction, the first paragraph of the discussion, and the last paragraph of the discussion. So make those sing. That's where you're really showing off your paper. Many journals give you the opportunity to suggest potential reviewers, and they even require you to suggest potential reviewers. This is your opportunity to help choose who looks at your paper. I would suggest knowledgeable reviewers who don't have potential conflicts of interest for you. So I never suggest my husband or my best friend or whatever. It does occasionally happen that people have conflicts in science, and so it's acceptable to ask for specific people to not be invited as reviewers to your paper if you can justify that, and just say, we have a conflict of interest. We disagree on the fundamentals of this theory or whatever. Dealing with rejection. Okay, now I realize I have to speed up. Rejection. It's a bummer, but we all get rejected. It's hard to deal with, but one of the sort of positive things you can do is to take the feedback you've received and revise your manuscript and send it somewhere else. This happens to all of us. Sometimes that means you need to collect more data. Sometimes it means you need another analysis, but take that feedback and use it and just move on. If you get a decision of revisions, be happy that you've got the opportunity to improve your manuscript. When you are asked to revise your manuscript, what you really need is a strategy for revisions For doing the revisions, they may require new tables, new figures, new analyses. You need to be very careful that you are engaging this feedback and changing the manuscript. And the way you communicate those changes is through a letter that's called the response to reviewers letter. The goal of this letter is to communicate to editors and reviewers who may re-review your paper. They're going to read it again and see what you've done. You want to communicate what changes you've made. And so I like to start by copying all the reviews into a document, and I use a different font color for the reviewers or font style for the reviewers' comments, and then use a different font for my own responses. And you need to respond to every single point that is brought up in the reviews. So these can be long documents, that's okay. There's a great paper that we're going to put a link to, 10 simple rules for writing a response to reviewers. Here are some examples from a letter I got, from reviews I got. We put the reviewers' comments in italics, our responses in plain font, and then anything that I've done to change the actual document, our manuscript, I use the Times New Roman, which is the font we use for the manuscript. And that just helps an editor sort of keep track of what's a reviewer comment, what is your response. I'm going to skip through some of this, but these are just some, as an editor, as someone who reads a lot of these letters, I see issues that come up that I think are worth thinking through. So this is a bad way to communicate to an editor. The reviewer did not understand what we were doing. A better way, perhaps we were unclear. What we meant to imply was this. The revised text clarifies this as follows, and then you put in that revised text. Bad, the reviewer is wrong. Better, we respectfully disagree with the reviewer. For the following reasons, our data show whatever. A reviewer comment, this is something I see a lot. A reviewer makes a very substantive comment about the conceptual underpinnings or the analysis of a manuscript, and then the response from an author is done. That doesn't tell the editor what you have actually done to change your text. And so it's better to say, we thank the reviewer for this insight. This is how we've changed our document. Thank reviewers. Reviewers are not paid or compensated, and many of them work very, very hard to provide constructive feedback. And the process of review peer review is to improve the papers, is to act as a guarantor of scientific integrity, but also to help you. It's not merely a rubber stamp. They help you improve your papers. Publication ethics. So Ima went into a lot of this, acknowledging your co-authors, etc. I'm going to skip to this. So let's say, yay, you got your paper published. Is your job over? Not really. You need to get out the word. You can talk about your paper on social media, on Twitter, on Facebook. You can send copies of your manuscript to your advisors, to your colleagues. Talk to your institution about a press release. Write a blog post. And really importantly, you should communicate your results back to the conservation managers, the park officials, local stakeholders, people who helped make your work possible and who might be interested in the results of your work. These are some great resources. Ima suggested some for writing. These are some of my favorite writing resources. And that is it. I want to say muchas gracias y suerte con esta to all of you. And that's the end of my presentation. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. A lot of food for thought here. We have a whole bunch of questions that folks have posted. And so what we're going to do, Fada and I are going to alternate asking these questions. And most of them can be answered by all of you, but some of these are very specific. So I'll address them to one individual and then others can contribute. So the first question is for Lisa particularly. It says, while judging the grants, the seed grants, do you consider whether the application is coming from developing countries versus developed countries? Because what is overly ambitious for some from a developing country might be a very normal task for a developed country with more facilities and resources. And I do think that this question could also be asked to Biotropica, right? So do you ask whether or not? That's my addition.
Right, so that's a very interesting question, and the seed grant committee that we put together was fairly diverse from different regions, and so we tried to share our ideas about that, and I think that we tried very hard to be representative regionally. In fact, you know, the tropics is a lot of lesser developed countries. And so we're definitely cognizant of the limitations, but, and we're also cognizant that there's a lot of northern workers working in the south, as some would say. And we did try to achieve a balance. And that is something that we actually are talking about. How can we assess that in the future, and with our diversity committee, in fact, do as well as we can. Now, this was our first year at it, and so we still have some ideas of how we did it well or not so well. And hopefully we'll have some good discussions on how the next round will be even better. I hope that helps.
Okay, Kat, you want to hear from me on that question?
Yes, I do. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, great. You know, one of the things I love about Biotropica is that it is an international journal. We are, as Amelia would say, we are pan-tropical and we are subtropical friendly. The reality is that typically in any given year, from 40 to 60% of our authors are student authors. And this typically is their first manuscript. We work really hard with our student authors. I guess I would say, you know, if so we do work really hard with them, and so this could often mean going through many more rounds of revisions than might be typical at a different journal. It could also mean making resources available for, say, an editor, a development editor to, you know, it's to help with English. We don't want, so if you are writing a manuscript and English is not your native language, I don't want to say that just run it through Google Translate and send it to us, but do your best and we will help you. We will help you make it possible. We don't want that to be the barrier to your work not being published. We also are, while we don't have sort of quotas, okay, we've already got our 20 papers from Brazil for, you know, for the next 2 issues. We're interested, and I'd say we work a little bit harder to really reflect that geographic breadth of where the tropics are. So, you know, if you're sending us your, you know, sort of heliconia study with the colibri, you know, from La Selva, maybe we've had lots of those papers. If you're sending us, you know, if you're a first-time author and you're coming from somewhere else, you know, we might. I think we work very hard to be geographic, to reflect the geographic scope of the tropics, and to work with our young authors and our young scientists.
Thank you very much, Lisa and Jennifer. We have another question for Ima. How important is it to include future perspectives and open-ended questions at the end of a manuscript?
I would say it's always good to put your results into the broader context on not only what has been done and how you have contributed, but what would be the future directions. I particularly like a few sentences or short paragraphs of saying, well, the future directions that this should take, or the next steps that this research should take. I think it helps to to see a pathway on that research and on towards that, improving the knowledge towards that topic. But because your research is always contributed, but knowledge never ends up there. So there is always room for improving and deepening and advancing in science. So I think it's very good to have future lines of research or directions of research, and sometimes some open-ended questions can be so insightful. If they are insightful and thoughtful, I think they could be positive.
Thank you, Ima. This is another question for Jennifer. How long does it take for a paper to be published?
How long does it take? Boy, yeah, what a great question. I can be honest and say that there's a, that is, there's a huge tail. There's a large range of variability in that. One of the things you might consider when you're thinking about where to submit your journal is the time to first decision. So that's really what's sort of important, or that's one of the variables. It's typical for Biotropica would be anywhere from 50 days to your first decision. Sometimes it's a lot earlier. Usually those very early decisions that you get aren't the best news. And there could be a very long tail for a number of reasons. Some, I would say, just based on my own experience publishing in a large number of different journals, it's probably typical to wait 2 to 3 months to hear to get your first decision. And if that is a review, like if that is revisions, which it often is, it's either rejected or revisions. I don't think I've had anything accepted first time around. It can be, you revise your paper and then it goes back out, and that could still be a month, 2, 3 months. So it's not sort of an instant gratification. You're kind of, your publications are part of sort of your permanent record. And so it can take more time than we all wished it did. But I think that time is spent, finding reviewers who can give you great feedback. Without a doubt, COVID-19 has pushed everything from all decision times are pushed back. It's just harder for everyone working at home, and I had to kick my kids off Netflix to get some bandwidth for this, stuff like that. But yeah, it's not something that you should think, oh, I've submitted my manuscript, in 2 months it will be published. That's unfortunately just not the case. And I think that's where some people are stepping in and submitting to preprint servers, which give you something that's citable as you're going through this process of submitting to a journal and revising and resubmitting.
Thank you, Jennifer. I have a question for Lisa. It says, what kind of innovative one could be in the introduction about the organism or the hypothesis or method?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand. What was what was that word you used? What kind
I think it refers to innovation that could be included in the introduction regarding the organism, or maybe it's about the hypothesis that will be innovative, or the method.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, it's sort of hard to be really broad, but I think the most important thing is to say, is to reiterate, nothing is 100% novel, but you probably wouldn't be doing this if you didn't think you had something novel. So it's of course finding that balance between, and I think all three of us have said how important it is to put your expectation of new results into some sort of background. And so I don't know if I was clear. I was talking at one point about like, maybe nobody's ever studied the species period, but that's unlikely. Yeah, it's really hard to say like to a particular species, how could you be innovative? It would have to depend. Are you doing behavior, ecology? I mean, there's just so many options. So I'm not sure if that answer really helps, but I think the importance is to put it in a context that's really clear and fair, and why you think it's new. But I'm not sure how much more specific I can go than that. Sorry.
Thank you. Our next question is for Jennifer or Ima, and probably both. It's how to approach issues of authorship and paying to submit or publish a paper with the journal. What is the best way to talk about these as an early career scientist working with collaborators?
Ima, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, I think my advice with this would be as honest and transparent early in the stage. So authorship, I think it's something that it's good to keep an open discussion, an open conversation, especially with your supervisor. And if you are gonna submit to a journal that needs you need to pay some fees, it's good to discuss with the supervisor whether there are funds available for those or whether they are going to be shared with co-authors and things like that. So I would say it's good to, at least when you are at the stage that you are submitted or you have your revisions and you think it's going to be accepted, perhaps. I don't know, Jennifer, would you like to add anything on that?
Yeah, Ima, I would completely agree with you that it's good to talk about these things earlier rather than later. If you're working on a grant, if you're funded by a grant, many grants do have funds in them to support page charges. Different journals have different sort of fee structures. And so I think that's important. That's another consideration, I guess, when you're deciding which journal to submit to. But I think having that open discussion with your collaborators about how any associated fees might be handled by someone on their grant or shared around, I think that's a discussion worth having, and probably sooner rather than later.
Thank you. I have another question for Lisa. It says, now that it's not possible for funders to make visits before they make a funding decision, do you suggest asking the current funder who has visited an existing program if they will give the recommendation about the program?
Oh, that's a fairly specific question. You know, in fact, I have never had a funder visit one of my programs, so I'm perhaps not the best person to ask this question to. But I will say that I think everybody who is on the deciding end of particularly big foundations is talking to all the other deciders. So if you do have an in with someone within the foundation who has visited you or funded you, I think I don't see that there's any conflict of interest to say, yes, could you share some of those findings with another funder? I don't see that as a problem personally. I don't know. Do the other panelists have any other comment on that? I'd be curious to see what you had to say too.
I would just say it's never come up for me, but I would be happy for anyone to share any information they have who's interested in potentially funding our work.
Not for me. No one has ever visited any of my site, any funder.
Yeah, I guess that might be more common for an NGO, for conservation organizations. And even there, I've worked on some conservation projects. It's so rare to get a funder down. So that's, I mean, it's just a point of discussion. I don't know how much funding has changed, funding opportunities with COVID. I do know that, like, I have a Nat Geo grant now that's active, and I know they've put off some of the regular scheduling, and yet they are also offering other smaller grant possibilities. So I think you just have to keep on top of all the changes. It is a very confusing time right now, I would say.
Thank you. For Ima, when writing a paper that addresses lab protocols or a methods paper, do they follow the same format as regular papers?
It's going to depend on the journal it's going to go. Not always. It doesn't usually, yeah, more protocol methods paper usually follow a slightly different structure, but not always. Sometimes they present a study case to present that, or sometimes they are just have a short introduction and then it's a presentation or a handbook of methods, different types of methods. So it depends on the type and how specific it is and to the journal, but yeah, it is often not that structure.
Can I just add a little follow-up on that? Now that there are journals that are devoted to publishing methods, like Methods in Ecology and Evolution, many journals, Biotropic included, have sort of moved away from publishing methods papers. So if you have a method and you want to publish it, it's really worth sort of thinking about where you're going to send it first, and not just think, oh, I'll send it to whatever journal. Really sort of target some of those journals that explicitly their mandate, their mission is to publish methods papers. Because many sort of more general journals are moving away from methods paper.
Thank you. Jennifer, another question for you. It says, is it common acceptable for the first-time authors to email the editors of a journal in advance or through the process with questions? For example, what are the costs of publishing in a given journal, or what are the timetables for feedback?
I would say, just based on my own experience, it certainly happens a lot. But what I would do is see if there are, if you can find information on that website before you actually, before you email an editor and say, hey, how much does it cost? Many of those sort of frequently asked questions, you can find some of those answers to on the website. That said, I think editors are certainly happy to demystify the publication process. And I've had, a few people email me and say, hey, we have this paper, this is the kind of thing it does. Is this appropriate for Biotropica? Would you consider this? And that's easy to look at that and say, hey, yeah, this is actually, this is totally in our wheelhouse. We'd be happy to have you send it to us, or say, we're moving away from methods papers. I think it'd be better off if you send it to Methods in Ecology or Evolution or whatever. So yes, people certainly do communicate with editors, but be aware. Again, we'll probably handle over 400 papers this year. Our time is pretty limited too, and if you could find out that information other ways, I would do that first.
I think it's me. So this is a question for Lisa. Would it be possible to receive feedback to the proposals that were rejected by the seed grant?
Yeah, that's everybody wants feedback because they want a better chance on the next one. I totally get that. Yeah, it's really hard. We had dozens and we already spent hours doing this. So yeah, we will take this request, and yeah, I know why that is, because especially if there's a chance to reapply. So we will take that as a request suggestion to the overall committee and see. I think if there were it sort of depends how we reorganize our judging and all. Like I showed you our criteria, and I have not shared what everybody's criteria are to them. you know, that they ended up getting judged by. Yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna say we will do that necessarily, but I agree. We should come up with a method that could make it quick and easy. So it's not too much time on too many proposals, but still gives you something. I can see that.
Thank you, Lisa. I have another question. This time is for you and for Ima. How different will an introduction for a grant proposal and for a specific man is, I'm sorry, how different will be the introduction for a grant proposal and for a scientific manuscript?
Lisa, do you want to start? Should I start? Okay, well, it's going to depend on which sort of proposal you're writing. So it could be but usually I would say the grant proposal is more, it could be more broader, so to say, to set up the big problem, the question, and the thing. In a scientific manuscript, it is an introduction that ultimately you want to present the state of art with the ecological theory, objectives and questions and hypotheses that you're going to be presenting, and ultimately you're going to be having throughout your results and discussions. So I think it is much more closed up or targeted, the introduction that you would grab for your scientific manuscript. That's my personal opinion. I don't know if Lisa or Jennifer have any insights on that too. If it's a small proposal, maybe it's shorter and very concise, but yeah, Lisa, go.
I guess I would just say, yeah, it can be a little more personal in the grant proposal too, about what you're bringing, what personnel, what skills, rather than, you know, I mean, it's a little bit of a different context. So I guess that would be what I would see as the biggest difference personally.
Yeah, what you were saying about a little bit highlighting the skills, bragging that you were saying, I think that's very important when you write a proposal, and would not be very appropriate in a scientific manuscript.
No, definitely, right. No, that's sort of exactly what I'm thinking in the back of my mind. You can say why you're prepared to do this, you know, what you know, obviously you can't do too much of that, but you can do some of it. And also, actually, this was something I think I meant to say, I didn't really say. If you don't have the capacity yourself, how are you going to involve other people? Where are you going to get complementary skill sets, you know, to help you complete some section?
Thank you. We have a more general question for ATBC, and I think it's appropriate because we have a lot of council members here that we could answer it. And it says, I have a general question. Does ATBC provide support to early career researchers, for example, in reviewing their proposal manuscript? If not, has the association thought to start something like that to help its members? And I have some ideas about that, but I'm gonna let the panelists talk.
I would say, so again, the capacity building committee can speak right up, but I would say in terms of manuscripts, sort of from the Biotropica angle, that support really, you know, sort of kicks in once you submit your manuscript. But we don't have any sort of official sort of pre-screening, like, you know, writing clinic that you might consult before you submit a manuscript. But I think that's a good.
Yeah, so I would also say, if people are involved, like with the regional group that they're in, or with the CES succeed, the, the student one. And then the mentoring sessions. I am not currently doing the mentoring, but when I did participate in the first year, I was very impressed at how supportive that could be. And I think that would be a very good forum. So I do think there's ways to do it. And actually, I think we should get some feedback on what people have used that worked for them the best.
I will put a plug in now because the Capacity Building Committee is considering, we're planning on doing some workshops coming up in January, particularly around, for example, abstract submission. So how to write an abstract, and then closer to the presentation, how to do a presentation. And in our next meetings, you can see how these can evolve into workshops about writing as well, where you have smaller groups of people workshopping. But this is hard to do on a large scale. So you can imagine why in-person meetings are very useful for these kinds of things. But we take these ideas if you want things like this, and we can consider it within ATBC.
Yeah, I would just add that the fact that I think that ATBC is a big community, and it's a very community interested in helping each other. So I think that throughout all these tools that my colleagues have mentioned, and especially the ones closer to me would be the mentoring scheme, and also the student and early careers group. I mean, you can make connections, and you can always establish more personal connections with people that you can ask for feedback or things on these things. So ATBC is like a big family. So probably there would be a lot of opportunities for that, but more on a personal basis.
Okay. Another question for Jennifer. Jennifer, you presented some criteria to choose a journal to submit a paper. Which of those criteria would you recommend to an early career to keep first in mind when choosing a journal?
No, that's a really good question. Again, I would say think about who you're talking to. When you're writing a paper, you're communicating to a certain audience. I think you want to be submitting your work to the people who you want to read it. That said, I do think the society journals, I would say a journal like Biotropica, not to not to tout Biotropica, but really does, as a society journal, I think part of the mission of ATBC that is carried out through the journal is to work with young authors, with first-time authors, and I think that that those are journals that are part of a larger community. Like Biotropica is definitely a part of the ATBC community. Then I think part of the mission of publishing the best tropical ecology and conservation that we can is helping develop the best tropical ecologists and conservationists that we can. And so I think those are additional considerations I would think about when thinking about which journals to send your first manuscript to.
This is a question specifically for Lisa. Lisa, can you suggest a search engine or website, I imagine, for neotropical research funding? So where do folks go to look for funding?
Gosh, I have to admit, I get stuck in a rut myself, sometimes going to the same ones. I know it won't, it's often really good to, really read newsletters. So like ATBC in their newsletter might make some announcements. OTS on their website would make some announcements that would be very appropriate for all the ATBC members. If you're doing animal behavior, they, would have their own. There's almost always at a university a grants office, and they can help, but I will say sometimes you just find them on your own better, and I don't know how that really happens. Does anyone else have other favorites they would like to suggest? Those are some of my favorites. And I will say a lot of societies have like these seed grants, you know, like Animal Behavior Society has a small grant program. Some bird societies have, often those are very small grants, even less than $1,000, like $500, but, which is a shame, but, you know, a lot of societies are doing that now.
Yeah, Lisa, I think those are good resources. And one I would add is that many of you who are graduate students are part of a graduate program. And on the website of your graduate program, there is often sort of a curated list of funding opportunities, which might include opportunities that are just through your university, but others that are more that, you know, that anyone can apply for. And in fact, when I kept checking my alma mater where I did my PhD, I checked their website for funding opportunities, I think 10 years after I had graduated. They just maintained a really great list. So universities, graduate programs, they can also have good lists.
I would also recommend that, for example, you mentioned there's Explorers Club, there's National Geographic, and there's also small things like the Garden Club of America will fund neotropical research. So for example, orchids, right? Things like that. So it's their odd little pockets of money that you've got to look around. Some botanical gardens have funds. And so if you have to look in the crevices of who will give you some money.
Rufford's a really good.
Yeah, I have one other suggestion, may not have been mentioned. Zoos and aquariums are also feeling like they have to do more outreach and in situ studies and work. So zoos are offering some grant opportunities too.
Okay, I have a really very specific question regarding writing manuscript. Could you give some tips to write a review paper?
Is that one for me or for Ima?
Yeah, it can be any of you.
Ima, do you want to start or?
Okay, sure. Well, I would say that to write a good review paper, the first thing to do is do a very, very thorough literature review and do a very, a systematic literature review and make sure you get a good bulk of literature and a state of art, and then try to organize on the different topics and present the different perspectives on that review. So it's always, sometimes the review can be, depends on the topic. It could be that you're reviewing an ecological theory and you could present different perspectives of the theory and then presenting some, or you're reviewing some concepts and presenting a new view, but then you have to do, it's like telling a story, I would say. So you try to summarize all the state of art that is on that specific topic throughout scientific manuscripts and bring it together and build a story around that topic. Jennifer, would you like to add some?
Yeah, I would add to that and just say that so it's important to kind of have a system for keeping track of the papers that you're citing and know how you actually search that literature. Editors love review papers. They tend to be cited very well. And I would add that really what you want to do is not only review all of these papers, but come up with some sort of synthesis of it. So not just say Davenport found this, Cardelus found this, Carrasco found this, you know, say collectively what did these different, you know, if you think of each paper as a piece of the puzzle, can you put those puzzle pieces together to sort of see what the image is? And so not only just say, we found this, they found that, they found that, really do some synthesis. And I think that's what makes a strong review paper that really is a nice contribution to the literature.
I'm going to follow that up. Some of our questions are getting more and more specific, but one of them is, how you build a good research question and then build the appropriate objectives. I think this is for EMA, if you have more than one. So do you ask your research question and then build it objective by objective, or do you do it by result by result? So how do we know what is the right result to discuss or not? So it's kind of, how do you build that paper, the meta structure, it sounds like.
I guess that my answer here is going to be a little bit biased towards my field, which is ecology and mostly community ecology, and might differ a little bit. But the way I think it usually, it is a broad aim. So I'm aiming to fill that knowledge gap, or to bring this. And then with that, I ask a few research questions, 1 or 2, 3. And with them, I have some hypotheses on those based on the state of art. So, and usually the way, so, and your question was as well, do I present the discussion by results? The results should be reflected throughout your research questions or your hypotheses. And usually it's good to structure the paper from biggest to the largest. So sometimes what happens is when you're starting your thesis or your dissertation, you have some research questions and you're going to present that. And then you're going to find that one that you thought it was your main research question, you didn't find something that big, but then something else came up which was very interesting, and you started pulling the thread, and that becomes a really neat, nice result and research question with hypotheses. So be able to also readapt what you did from your dissertation or thesis to the manuscript, and put the most important, most relevant results first, and then 1 or 2 more secondaries that are complementing, and then keep that structure throughout the results and in the discussion. That would be my take.
Thank you, Emma. And last question for Jennifer. For submitting to Biotropica, should we suggest potential referees for our papers?
Yes, yes, you should. And you also have the opportunity to identify a preferred subject editor. So which of our editorial board you think is best able to sort of handle your paper. So definitely most journals now will ask you or require you to suggest potential reviewers, and even give a brief explanation to why that person is an appropriate reviewer for your manuscript. Absolutely.
We've run out of time. We have more questions, but unfortunately we can't address them all, but we want to thank our panelists. Thank you so much for your insight into writing and publishing. And I also want to tell our audience, remind you all to please visit our website often. We have lots of new things and upcoming events, such as a town hall, writing workshops, more webinars. Look out for a survey that will be coming your way, where you can ask for more activities and things like that. What can we do to help our membership? And if you have ideas or questions for us, you can email us directly through the website for ATBC. So thank you very much. And there's another webinar coming up in soon. I don't know the date right now, I'm sorry. Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks for the
all.
opportunity. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.